The Northwest Indian War, also known as the Ohio War, Little Turtles War, and by other names, was a war between the United States and a confederation of numerous Indian tribes, with support from the British, for control of the Northwest Territory. It followed centuries of conflict over this territory, first among Native American tribes, and then with the added shifting alliances among the tribes and the European powers of France and Great Britain, and their colonials. Under the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolutionary War, Great Britain ceded to the U.S. control of the Northwest Territory, which was occupied by numerous Native American peoples. Despite the treaty, the British kept forts and policies that supported the natives in the Northwest Territories. In 1787, there were 45,000 Native Americans in the territory, and 2,000 French. President George Washington directed the United States Army to halt the hostilities between the Indians and settlers and enforce U.S. sovereignty over the territory. The U.S. Army, consisting of mostly untrained recruits supported by equally untrained militiamen, suffered a series of major defeats, including the Armour campaign and St. Clair's defeat, which were resounding Native American victories. About 1,000 soldiers and militiamen were killed, and the United States forces suffered many more casualties than their opponents. After St. Clair's disaster, Washington ordered Revolutionary War hero General Mad Anthony Wayne to organize and train a proper fighting force. Wayne took command of the new Legion of the United States late in 1793. He led his men to a decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. The defeated tribes were forced to cede extensive territory, including much of present-day Ohio, in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Background: Beaver Wars. The land east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes had been fought over for centuries before the United States government was formed. In 1608, French explorer Samuel Champlain sided with the Huron people living along the St. Lawrence River against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy living in what is now upper and western New York State. The result was a lasting enmity by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy towards the French, which caused them to side with the Dutch fur traders coming up the Hudson River in about 1626. The Dutch offered better prices than the French and traded firearms, hatchets and knives to the Iroquois in exchange for furs. With these more sophisticated weapons, the Five Nations nearly exterminated the Huron and all of other Native Americans living immediately to the west in the Ohio Country during the Beaver Wars, beginning in the 1640s. The Native American tribes were competing for hunting grounds for the fur trade. The western tribes had also been weakened by epidemics of European infectious diseases, against which they had no acquired immunity. The Five Nations' use of modern weapons caused the wars to become deadlier. Historians consider the Beaver Wars to have been one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of North America. About 1664, the Five Nations became trading partners with the British, who conquered the New Netherlands from the Dutch. The Five Nations enlarged the territory by right of conquest. The number of tribes paying tribute to them realigned the tribal map of eastern North America. Several large confederacies were destroyed or relocated, including the Huron, Neutral Erie, Susquehannock and Shawnee. The Five Nations pushed several other eastern tribes to and even across the Mississippi River. The Ohio Country was virtually emptied, as the defeated tribes fled west to escape the Five Nations warriors. After the Five Nations warriors were defeated, they left much of the Northwest Territory, Kentucky and Ohio almost unpopulated and with abandoned villages. They had claimed the entire Ohio Valley as their own exclusive hunting ground. After about 1700, some remnants of the Native American tribes began returning to the Northwest Territory. They were often conglomerations of several tribes who paid tribute to the Five Nations. French and British occupation throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Both Britain and France claimed ownership of the Ohio Country, in competition with the Five Nations, and by the mid-18th century had sent merchants and fur traders into the area to trade with local natives, the actual inhabitants of the territory. Violence quickly erupted. During the French and Indian War, an extension in North America of the 7 Years' War in Europe, Indian tribes allied with either the French or British, often depending on trading priorities, and warred with each other and the colonists. When it was defeated, France relinquished all its territorial claims to Britain in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British still faced opposition from numerous Native American tribes, including in the Great Lakes region, the Ottawa, Ojibwa, Potawatomi, and Huron in the eastern Illinois country, the Miami, Wea, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, and Piankashaw, and in the Ohio country, the Delaware, Shawnee, Mingard, and Wyandot. The tribes were angered by the arrogance of British colonial officials who treated them like defeated subjects and concerned by the growing threat of British colonials moving to settle in the territories. They attacked during Pontiac's Rebellion of 1763–66, when the Indians burned several British forts on the land. They killed and drove many settlers out of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes Territory. In response, Britain sent troops to reinforce Fort Pitt, which ultimately succeeded despite an ambush by the natives in the nearby Battle of Bushy Run. The war petered out without a clear winner. The natives remained undefeated yet had not managed to drive British colonial forces out of the territory. Britain officially closed the Northwest Territories to colonial settlement by the Proclamation of 1763, in an effort to create peace with the tribes west of the Appalachian Mountains. On June 22, 1774, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which annexed the Northwest Territories to the province of Quebec. Some colonials, wanting to move to new lands, described this as one of the intolerable acts that contributed to the American Revolution. American Revolution, a faction of the Cherokee led by Dragging Canoe, as well as the Shawnee, were already at war with the Long Knives, starting in 1776, in the Cherokee-American Wars, which merged into the Northwest Indian Wars. During the American Revolution, 4 of the 6 nations of the Iroquois League sided with the British. The Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga and Seneca fought against colonists in the Battle of Oriskany, aided the British in the Battle of Wyoming in Pennsylvania and at Saratoga, Cherry Valley, and other raids throughout the Mohawk Valley in New York, as well as in numerous other actions on the frontiers of New York and Pennsylvania. As the British concentrated on the southern United States in 1779, General George Washington took action against the Six Nations. He instructed General John Sullivan to attack and destroy Six Nations villages in Upper New York. Leading about 5,000 troops, Sullivan defeated the Six Nations forces in the Battle of Newtown, then destroyed over 46 Nations villages and all the stored crops in the fall of 1779. Because of the social disruption and crop losses, some Six Nations men, women, and children died of starvation that winter. Many Six Nations families retreated to Fort Niagara and other parts of Canada, where they spent a cold and hungry winter. The power in the present-day United States territory was lessened, and the claim to the Northwest Territories was challenged. In 1778, American General George Rogers Rogers Clark and 178 men captured the British forts on the Mississippi and Wabash rivers. This gave the United States control of the Ohio River and a claim to all the land north of the Ohio. In the fall of 1779, Indians allied with the British attacked a company of men under Col. David Rogers and Captain Robert Benham near Cincinnati. Only a handful of soldiers survived the attack. In 1780, a French officer named Augustin de la Balme led a volunteer militia from Vincennes on a raid of Cacomia, with the goal of capturing Fort Detroit. This marks the first known victory for Little Turtle, who gathered available warriors and destroyed La Balme's force. As the war with the British came to a close, the young United States looked to secure the borders, exact revenge for Native American raids, and expand westward. In March 1782, a band of Pennsylvania militia entered Ohio country and massacred a Christian Lenape village of Northern.It. 2 months later, Colonel William Crawford led 500 volunteers deep into Ohio country and attacked Native American villages near the Sandusky River. Crawford's force was defeated with a loss of about 70 Americans killed, and several prisoners were executed in retaliation for the Northern.It massacre. In August of 1782, the last battle of the American Revolutionary War, the Battle of Blue Licks, was fought in Kentucky, on a hill next to the Licking River in what is now Robertson County, Kentucky. A force of about 50 British Rangers and 300 natives ambushed and routed 182 pursuing Kentucky militiamen. With the end of the war, the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain gave the United States independence and control of the Northwest Territories. At least on paper, the Six Nations allies were forced to cede most of the land in New York State to the United States, and many Six Nations families moved on to land reserves in Old Quebec Province. Post-war tensions. The Ohio Territory was subject to overlapping and conflicting claims by the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and Virginia, and to those by the Shawnee, Mingard, Lenape and other actual inhabitants, who were no longer considered tributary to the Six Nations. While the British had suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Yorktown, there had been no decisive defeat for the native allies in the Northwest Territories. The native tribes in the Old Northwest were not party to the treaty. Many leaders, especially Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, refused to recognize the United States' claims to the area northwest of the Ohio River. The British remained in possession of the Great Lakes forts, through which they continued to supply Native American allies with trade items and weapons in exchange for furs. Some in the British government wished to maintain a neutral native territory between Canada and the United States, but most agreed that immediate withdrawal was not possible without sparking a new war with natives. The lingering British presence was not formally ended until the withdrawal from the Great Lakes forts pursuant to the Jay Treaty negotiated in 1794, and it would continue informally afterward until the War of 1812. Through the public sale of Western lands, the Confederation Congress sought to stabilize the dollar and pay down some of its war debt. The Land Ordinance of 1785 gave encouragement to land speculators, surveyors, and settlers who sought to gain new land from the Native Americans who may or may not have had a claim to it. To acquire most of the eastern portion of the Ohio country, Congress negotiated the Treaty of Fort Mackintosh in 1785 with several Indian tribes. Settlers from Connecticut were already streaming into the Western Reserve, which extended into part of a reservation set aside for some of the tribes. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, passed by the U.S. Congress under the Articles of Confederation, gave Native Americans title, under U.S. law, to enjoy whatever lands they lived on. It also encouraged the influx of U.S. settlers north of the Ohio River. Localized ambushes and engagements between those settlers and natives continued. The failure of the 1789 Treaty of Fort Armour to address underlying grievances between the two sides only exacerbated the problems. Fort Washington was built in 1789 to protect United States settlements in the Sims Purchase. The new fort added security for settlers, but unsettled the Native American nations living north of the Ohio River. Fort Washington became the first of a line of forts advancing north into Ohio, and the combined Native American tribes would soon demand the destruction as a condition of peace. Formation of the Confederacy. Cooperation among the Native American tribes forming the Western Confederacy had gone back to the French colonial era. It was renewed during the American Revolutionary War. The Confederacy first came together in the autumn of 1785 at Fort Detroit, proclaiming that the parties to the Confederacy would deal jointly with the United States, rather than individually. This determination was renewed in 1786 at the Wyandotte village of Upper Sandusky. The Confederacy declared the Ohio River as the boundary between the lands and those of American settlers. The Wyandotte were the nominal fathers, or senior guaranteeing tribe of the Confederacy, but the Shawnee and Miami provided the greatest share of the fighting forces. The Confederacy included warriors from a wide variety of peoples: Wyandotte, Shawnee, Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Lenape, Miami, Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, Wabash Confederacy, Chickamauga Cherokee. In most cases, an entire tribe was not involved in the war. The Indian societies were generally not centralized. Villages and individual warriors and chiefs decided on participation in the war. Nearly 200 Cherokee warriors from two bands of the over-mountain towns fought alongside the Shawnee from the inception of the Revolution through the years of the Indian Confederacy. In addition, the Chickamauga Cherokee leader, Dragging Canoe, sent a contingent of warriors for a specific action. Some warriors of the Choctaw and Chickasaw tribes, which had been traditional enemies of the Northwest tribes, served as scouts for the United States during these years.